Hello and welcome to another YouTube live event. My name is Derek Tafuma. I'm going to be running quite a lot of these events. I must warn you that in today's event there might be quite a lot of things that are difficult to understand. But I think it'll take a lot of repetition and a lot of discussions, a lot of inputs from others. To get to the bottom exactly what is going on in terms of, for example, I want to talk about the curse of foreign aid. Okay, so foreign aid has been given to African countries for over 50 years, but there has been no meaningful progress in terms of the economies of African countries. And it's difficult to find a country which has grown its own economic growth and development, its own gross domestic product, using funding from aid. So the aid model is difficult to understand, it is difficult to implement, and perhaps it is not the right thing for African countries. For starters, we don't even have an exit plan, so we don't know how we are going to get out of this cycle of dependency, depending on foreign aid. So Africa has been receiving foreign aid to fund economic growth and development for more than half a century, with no meaningful results in its economies. Foreign aid has been a monumental failure, and African governments must take responsibility and accept that they need to honestly rethink the foreign aid model, which keeps them asking for more. You have to ask why we keep asking for more. Why do we run out of money? Okay, so we need to think about what money is and why we keep accepting money from outside the country. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you get money from Europe or from America, the money is likely to go back to Europe or to America, because that is where the money is used. That is where the money has value. That is where there is demand for that money, which is why you find that American dollars always go back to America, because that's where they belong. So the African aid model has no exit plan in sight, which means we don't know when we are going to stop borrowing money, because the problem is the very concept of money is itself based on debt. Okay, money cannot exist without debt. Money itself is debt. So giving debt to African countries ensures the survival of money. It cannot survive without debt. So it keeps African countries indebted forever as they constantly play catch up with interest rates. So the interest rates are always going up. The demand for that money is always going up in countries where there is a shortage of money, in countries which have not figured out how to create their own money. If you look at Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabwe has lost its own currency. It has abandoned its own currency. It has abandoned its own money, which means now it needs money from outside the country. So there is always going to be a demand, and as I speak, there is a liquidity crunch or a liquidity crisis in Zimbabwe. So the economic blueprints that have been adopted have failed due to poor implementation and fiscal indiscipline. Okay, so not only is it difficult to implement these blueprints, which come from America, which come from the Europe, okay, have been very difficult to implement by African countries, and there has to be a reason why. There has to be a reason why we are failing to implement them, because they have been tried in an environment where there are structures in place, where there is a rule of law, where there are checks and balances, and then you take them to an African country where even the ministers and the president and the well-to-do, the connected guys, they are looking to purchase luxury items using that money. They are looking to drive the latest model of a car. They want to build big mansions. But by so doing, all this money is going back, because these cars are being bought in Europe, okay? They are being bought in America. Some of the materials for the houses they are building are being imported from outside the country. So there's a demand for foreign currency, because foreign currency is bringing in those luxury items which Africans want. They want to live the same life as some of those people in Europe. But some of those people in Europe are not even worried about these luxury items. So there's a problem there. The government officials have benefited from free cash at the expense of the poor majority. So the government is getting free cash. The cash arrives into their accounts, and sometimes the cash doesn't even come into their accounts. The cash sometimes stays in Europe, okay? And what you get, maybe it's payment for companies that are going to run projects in Africa, okay, to benefit Africans but only for so long. So this money is not even finding its way into Africa. It's paying these companies in Europe, which then go and perform, they carry out some activities in Africa, okay? So there's a cycle after cycle, and budget after budget. African governments have funded public goods and services using foreign aid to the extent that they have become more accountable to foreign aid donors than to the electorate who put them into power. So imagine the poor electorate in African countries, the electorate, they vote somebody into power, but that person does not really need the African vote, okay? Because it is not the African voter who is paying taxes to this government, because the taxes that they are paying is not enough, would never be enough to be able to run, for this government to run the country. So basically they are surviving on donor funding, okay, on monies from donor countries. So they owe their allegiance more to the donor funders than to the electorate, okay? It is time for the African smart creatives scattered across the globe to step up to the plate and lead the African Renaissance. Maybe we need a new African Renaissance. The platforms for interaction are now available with the growth of the information superhighway. So we do have the platforms. We have failed to use the traditional physical platforms or available platforms. We have destroyed them and failed to use them to grow our own economies. Now we've got new platforms which are scattered all over the internet. And I think it is time for Africans to collaborate once more, collaborate and see how we can solve African problems, okay, through collaboration, through these platforms. Now, one thing that I would like to say about foreign aid is that as much as it is not helping African countries to develop, or as much as it is not helping the African poor to become better, and we don't expect them to, because their problem back in Europe is solved. What these donor agencies or donor funders are doing is creating a very big donor community. It's a donor industry, I like to call it, where they are employing a lot of people. Okay, I've seen neighbors who are running aid agencies who are living very well in this country, because I don't know how they are doing it, but they have found employment due to problems in Africa. So the challenges that we have in Africa are actually providing opportunities for people in Europe, people in America. They are able to have a chief executive officer of an aid agency who is employing people to carry out charity work. Okay, so charity has become a very big industry, and it's contributing to the economy of the Western countries. Okay, so I think it's time that Africa rethinks the aid model. It's time that it starts to think about how it can create its own capital, how it can create its own money, and how, because the biggest problem that I see is that Africans have concentrated on the armed struggle, which they have won, okay, which is why there have been independence all over the place in Africa. Every African country now is independent. The only problem is that we did not realize there was an economic war to fight after that. Okay, so we've not been proactive in defending or in fighting an economic war. Neither did we realize that there is a currency war taking place. We look at America and China. There's been talk of currency wars. There's been talk of currency manipulation. So we need to understand that even the US dollar that Zimbabwe is using is subject to a currency war with China. So when Zimbabwe is using the US dollar, China is looking at Zimbabwe and thinking, I wish they were using our own yuan renminbi. Okay, so we need to be aware that not only is there an armed struggle, but there's also an economic struggle, and there is also a currency struggle. So far, we are losing on the currency struggle in Zimbabwe because we've abandoned our own currency. Okay, I will not talk about the bond notes and the goats in this installment, but this is the state of the situation in Zimbabwe. So we need to think about those things. We need to think about the aid model. So we need to think about how we can come up with an economic plan which is drafted by every Zimbabwean. Okay, if we relegate economic issues to the ruling party, then I think we're in for a very long ride. And we also need to think about currency wars, because I think this is something which is taking place, and we have lost without realizing we're even in the fight. So I'm going to end it here and just encourage African countries to rethink the aid model and to try to come up with, because we've got the capital, we just don't count it. We're just not aware that it's there. We're just not aware what we have. You've seen with the issue of the goats how we're able to notice how we can actually bring goats into mainstream economy, because the goats are not counted. So we don't know how many we have in Zimbabwe, for example, and we don't know how much they are worth in total. We don't know how many cows we have. So if we don't know how many cows we have, we don't know what they are worth. So we don't know the worth of a lot of things, including some plants as well as a lot of animals. So these are the things that we need to think about as we start to dig deeper into how economic issues actually operate. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next video.